Okay, welcome back. We are on Daf Hey Omer Aleph, almost at the bottom. The second line of the big lines, Yitzis Shabbos Shteim Shein Arba. So, we're quoting now from the Mishnah. So, if you remember, the Mishnah had a few ideas that are Shtayim Shein Arba, that are two that equal four, right? They're two that equal four. So here is another one that's Shtayim Shein Arba, which is Yitzis Shabbos. Yitzis Shabbos is carrying on Shabbos. The idea of carrying on Shabbos. As we know, the main thing of carrying on Shabbos, there's two things you have to know about carrying on Shabbos. The main idea is taking from a private domain into a public domain, and you actually have to lift it in one domain and put it down in another domain. If you just lift it in one domain but you never put it down, that's not. It has to be an akira and an anacha. It's called in Aramaic. Akira means to lift it, and anacha means to put it down. So if you didn't do that, so at least biblically, it's not the issue. Not the issue of carrying. So when we learned Yitzias Shabbos Shtayim Shein Arba, when we learned it in the Mishnah, what did we say? That there's two ideas that are that are mentioned, and that's basically if the poor person sticks his hand into the house and he takes it out. And if he's outside, he's in the public domain, he sticks his hand and takes it out, or if the balabas that's inside the house, he takes it and puts it out into the public domain, right? And what's shehein arba? The opposite way, right? If the poor person takes it from the public domain and puts it into the private domain, or if the balabas sticks his hand outdoors and takes something indoors, right? So those are the shehein arba.
Where does the public domain begin?
The street.
The street. So you have
his window. Oh, here comes Dave. His window. Yeah. So that's the Shtayim Shein Arba that we talked about in our Mishnah, right? The two that are really four. So now, what the Gemara is going to bring up is a Gemara that the Gemara thinks that you know about. Which the truth is, I do know about it because it's a very famous beginning of Gemara Shabbos. Here we're talking about Shevuos, right? We're talking about oaths, about promises, and we had a scenario of Shtayim Shein Arba. So the Mishnah went and brought other scenarios of Shtayim Shein Arba. But we have a very clear Shtayim Shein Arba when it comes to Shabbos in Gemara Shabbos. And that's where the Gemara starts. Right away at the beginning of Gemara Shabbos, Tanan Hasam, we learned over there. What's over there? Over there is Gemara Shabbos. Literally, if I don't know if your Gemara gives you the location of it, but it's based on Aleph. It's literally the beginning of Gemara Shabbos. The first Mishnah in Gemara Shabbos says like this: Yitzias Shabbos, Shtayim Shein Arba Bifnim. There's two that equals four while you're on the inside, and Shtayim Shein Arba Bachutz, and there's two that equals four while you're on the outside. What's going on over here, right? So that's Gemara. So it's interesting because if you think what I told you about the Shtayim Shein Arba in our Mishnah is the conclusion. So we're going to have to take this step by step without understanding the conclusion, because the conclusion obviously answers what the Gemara is going to tell us. But Shtayim Shein Arba B'fnim and Shtayim Shein Arba B'chutz is Shtayim. There's two scenarios where you're liable, where you did the deed, which and two scenarios that you're not, whether you're inside or whether you're outside, from the inside and from the outside. What's the scenario that you're not liable? When are you potter? When are you potter? So I mentioned this in passing before, when you didn't do both the akira and anacha. What if the person from the inside takes something from the table in the dining room, goes to the window, and he doesn't put it down in the public domain? He gives it to the person standing, the ani standing in public domain, and that guy puts it down. So now he didn't do the akira and the anacha, right? In that case, it's pater. It's pater avolaser, meaning you're not allowed to do it, but you're not liable biblically because you didn't do both. You have to pick it up in the private domain and put it down in the public domain in order to really do the deed of carrying. Right, so that's why the Mishnah over there in Gemara Shabbos says Shtayim. There's two types that you're not that you could be liable. Shehein Arba. There's another two, but those two you're not liable for. That you're potter. In general, there's a difference. You have to keep in mind that when it says in the Gemara potter doesn't mean that you're allowed to do it. Potter means you're not liable. If you were allowed to do it, it would say mutar. Just keep that in mind. Pater means just that it's not the biblical thing that was in mind, but still something that we don't do. And today with an Eitiv, we don't even deal with these kinds of things, but still it's right. Yeah, some places that have natural Eitivs, it's even easier. Montreal also, because it's an island, it's more lenient when it comes to Eitiv, because we're considered an island already is surrounded, has its own natural Eitiv, so to speak. And the question is, if there is a highway in Montreal that could be considered to be a Rishus Harabim, a real public domain, it's a big discussion, but it's Montreal is a little easier. Yeah.
You say that the river is a natural Erev, but it's attacked, but there are bridges over that river.
Oh, so bridges don't, bridges are entrance ways to a private domain, don't make the private domain not private, right? So a bridge could be an entranceway to a private domain, that's fine. The bigger issue really is the Cary Expressway, the highways, because that, even though, see, when you have a private domain, so my backyard, it's private domain, right? It's no problem. But what if it's not just my backyard? I want to include other places into that backyard, or I have a piece of land and it's a few acres big, right? So then there's more that you have to do to make a proper Erev. But the issue is that a public domain, a real public domain, you can't make it into a private domain. But what's considered a public domain? So in halacha and Gemara, primarily, at least biblically, it has to be a place that there's 600,000 people, right? Because that's what's a public domain, where the Jews were in the desert. It was 600,000 people, and that's considered to be a Rishus Harabim, a public domain. Do we have that today? Yes, on certain highways you can have 600,000 people going through the place in one day, right? So then you could, but we don't have a street in Dollard like that. So therefore, everything goes down a level. It's only rabbinic that you're not allowed to carry. It's not biblical that you're not. Anyways, all these things come into consideration. But a Rishus Harabim in Atera, meaning a public domain, a biblical public domain, something like the Cary Expressway, is practically impossible. You can't put an Eitiv in a public domain. Right? What do you got to do? Making it private. It belongs to millions of people. How are you making it private? Oh, if it belongs to less than that, so then we could talk about it. We could do something about it. That's just a small part of a massive conversation when it comes to Eitivs. 600,000, yeah. But it's a massive conversation when it comes to Eitiv. It's very complicated. Bedford, yeah. Yeah, there's other Eastern Parkway, for example. It's a big conversation about Eastern Parkway, which is good. The street where 770 is, Crown Heights. It's a massive boulevard. It's a parkway, right? There's a service lane on either side. There's a parkway in the middle. And so it's a big conversation if that could be considered it could be part of an Eitiv or not. And it became a big discussion. In general, as you know, we've talked about this many times, as much as an Eitiv is okay, in Chabad we don't use city Eitivs, which is not to say that there's a problem with Eitiv, it's just that the stringency that we take upon ourselves in Chabad. So it becomes a whole discussion in Crown Heights if there is an Eitiv, there isn't an Eitiv, especially when it comes to Eastern Parkway. Huh? Certain Sfardim don't, yeah, certain Sfardim don't, and certain Chassidim also don't deal with natives. Anyways, but it's a whole conversation. Anyways, that being said, what's the question over here? Oh, so we brought the Mishnah from Gemara Shabbos, where over there it says there's Shtaim Shein Arba inside and there's Shtaim Shein Arba outside. That's so, and over here we only said one time Shtaim Shein Arba. So what's going on over here, right? We said in our case that when it comes to carrying on Shabbos, there's 2 that equals 4, but the Mishnah in Gemara Shabbos says there's 2 that equals 4 inside and 2 that equals 4 outside, right? So that the Gemara asks, what's different over here? The Tana Shtaim Shein Arba v'Suloi that just says Shtaim Shein Arba, and that's it. Doesn't give you anything more. And what's different over there? Hasam in Gemara Shabbos. The Tane Shtaim Shein Arba b'fnim, Shtaim Shein Arba b'chutz, that it gives you 2 that equals 4, but double 2 times, but inside and outside. So what does the Gemara answer? It's a simple answer that the Gemara answers right away, right? It's not the accepted answer of the Gemara. It says Hasam over there. Hasam means over there. So what is over there? Over there, obviously referring to Gemara Shabbos. The Iker Shabbos, that's the main place we're discussing the laws of Shabbos. We're not here. We're learning about Shavuos. We're learning about oaths. It happens to be, ADD think it's something new that the doctors found. They look at a Gemara, right? Hey, you're talking about Shtaim Shein Arba. Let me give you another case, Shtaim Shein Arba. We're not going to go into the details of it. The details of it. You want to know the details of Shabbos? Open up a Gemara Shabbos. Don't know. You're not going to get it over here, right? So Hasam over there, the Iker Shabbos, that it's the main place. Where we talk about what you could do, we can't do on Shabbos. So Tani Avis told us. Hacha the Lavi Shabbos Avis Tani told us like Tani. So there's main categories and there's secondary categories. Main categories are called Avis, if you want to literally translate it, fathers, and told us is offspring, right? So there that it is the main place we're going to discuss the issues of Shabbos, the laws of Shabbos. So it mentions the primary categories and it mentions the secondary categories. Over here, that we're not talking about the main ideas of Shabbos. It's not something that we're going to be talking about over here. So therefore, it mentions the Aves, it mentions the primary categories, but it doesn't mention the secondary categories. So what's the main categories and what's the secondary categories when it comes to Shabbos? So, yeah, what?
Oh, yeah,
no. Within this carrying, what's of and what's tolda, what's the primary and what's secondary. I mentioned it in passing before. This is one of the lamates. In this lamates, which one? In this one of the lamates. Taking from a private domain into a public domain. That's the main issue that mentions the Torah. Doesn't mention about taking from a public domain into a private domain. So that it's still something that you can't do, but it's a secondary category, right? Because it doesn't say it in the pasuk. That's what that's what the Gemara seems to be saying. Well, let's see it inside. Avos ma'ininu, right? What are the primary categories? What are the avos? What are the primary categories when it comes to carrying? Yitzios, right? Taking out. Yitzia means to take out. Taking out from a private domain to a public domain. That's the primary. Yitzi is tar tehavyon. So the Gemara says, 1 second, taking out. There's two. If there's two, what's the shtaim shein arba? Taking out from a private domain to a public domain, there's only two scenarios. There's either the person inside is taking out, or the person outside is putting his hand in and taking out. So what's shein arba? Right? What did we explain? What's the shein arba? Putting it inside, right? Taking from public domain. The Gemara is not there yet, right? Just keep that in mind, just so you understand the Gemara over here, right? So the Gemara says that if you're going to say that the primary category is only Yitzios, only going from private to public, that's the only thing that is Yitzios, right? So then you only have two. You only have two scenarios. So what are you saying? Shtaim shein arba. What are the other two? Shein arba. So v'chi tema. If you're going to say mehen l'chiv mehem l'ptur, that there are scenarios that this shein arba, the other two are when you're potter. What's the scenario that you're potter? Right, but what do you have to do in order to be potter? So chayiv, we know, is if you take from the private domain and you put it down in the public domain. What's potter? You hand it to somebody else, and you don't do both sides of the deal, right? You only take it from one, right? So then there could be shein arba, right? That could be the shein arba. So, but we have a problem with this, and we had this in another earlier Gemara. But we said that all the shtaim shein arbas of our Mishnah are all similar. And by Maris Negoim, what's Maris Negoim? We might get to it today as well. Maris Negoim is the leper, right? The leper also has shtaim shein arba. What is the shtaim shein arba of the leper? There's two types of white that the Torah mentions, se'es and bahares, right? That the Torah says in the pasuk. And we learned another two types of white, secondary white colors. One is the lime, what's it called, that they used in the temple, in the Mishkan, and the other one was the white of the egg, right? So they're both off-white, right? And those are secondary whites that we include in Seis and Baharis. But the person is still Tameh, even if he has the secondary color, right? So we can't say that when it comes to Shabbos, Shtayim, you're liable, the other Shtayim, Shein Arba, you're not liable. No, it has to be similar to the Mitzayda, to the leper, that is Tameh in all four scenarios, right? So we can't say that Shtayim is L'chiyuv, is you're liable, and two, the extra two are Liptur, are when you're not liable. So Ma'asim Kul L'chiyuv, Afacha Kul M'chiyuv, right? So we have to say that there are all scenarios that the person is liable. So we can't say that Shtayim Shein Arba is Shtayim, two that he's liable, and two that he's not liable, two that he's pater. So Elam Rav Papa, so Rav Papa comes and answers. And Rav Papa says, Hasan, over there in Shabbos, the Iker Shabbos, Tani Chiyuv Ptori. Chiyuv Tani Ptori Loi Tani. So he says, over there in Shabbos, he mentions Shtayim Shein Arba Bifnim and Shtayim Shein Arba B'chutz. Two that are for inside and two that are for outside. And what did I tell you? And this is basically according to Rav Papa over here. He's gonna explain it in a moment. You're gonna see it inside in a moment. That there's two that you're liable and two that you're not liable. Going one way and two going the other way, right? Two going from the private domain to the public domain, two scenarios that you're liable, and another two scenarios that you're not liable, which is if you're only doing half the job, right? Meaning that if the person inside picks up the thing, puts it outside into the hands of a poor person, right? Or the poor person sticks his hand inside, grabs it from the person standing inside and takes it out, right? So those scenarios you're not liable. That's Shtayim Shein Arba B'fnim, and then Shtayim Shein Arba B'chutz is the opposite, right? Not going from a private to public, from public to private, right? So over there in Gemara Shabbos, Shtayim Shein Arba B'fnim, Shtayim Shein Arba B'chutz is talking about two that you're liable, two that you're not liable, two that you're liable, two that you're not liable. That's there. And over here, Hacha, in our Mishnah, Chiyuv Tani is only talking about the four scenarios that you're liable. Shtayim is the two scenarios of going from private to public domain. And then we add on also if you went from public to private domain. That's Shein Arba, which you are liable if you did the full action. And that's the way the Gemara, that's the way the Papa explains it. Let's see it inside. Oh, no, the Gemara asks, Chiyuve Maininu. What are the scenarios where you're liable when you carry? Right? Yitzios. How could it be? So it says Yitzios. Yitzios means taking out. Taking out, the Gemara, I'm just going to tell you outside for a moment, the Gemara is going to tell you, and in the Hebrew it works, Yitzios means taking from private to public. That's what Yitzios means, right? It says Yitzios. Yitzios tartu davim. There's only two scenarios of taking from private to public. So what's the Shein Arba? So the Gemara right away says, no, Shtayim daitza, Shnayim da'achnasa. There's two scenarios of haitza'a, which means taking out, and two scenarios of achnasa, which means bringing into the house, right? There is. But what's the problem with the Gemara is going to have is that the Mishnah says Yitzios, only taking out. The Mishnah doesn't mention bringing in. So the Gemara says V'ha Yitzios Ketani. The Mishnah says Yitzios. The Mishnah says taking out. The Mishnah doesn't say bringing in. So Amar Ravashi, Rav Ashi says Tanach Noso Nami Eitzah Karilei. No. Ravashi says taking in, taking out. It's the same thing. The same thing. What's the difference, right? When he says Eitzah, he means also Achnasa. So the Gemara says Mimai. How do we know this? We're on Daf Hey Amud Beis now. Because we learned it says like this in a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Gemara Shabbos on Daf Ayin Gimel. It says like this: Hamaitzim Rishus L'Rishus. If someone takes from one domain to another domain, what does that mean? Rishus L'Rishus, one domain to another domain. So it doesn't matter if it's going from a private domain to a public domain or from a public domain to a private domain. Rishus L'Rishus means from one domain to another domain, right? Chayiv. This person's liable. Can't do that. right? From one domain to another domain. Mila yaskinan de kama ayala yuli. Are we only talking about someone taking from a public domain to a private domain? The Mishnah says hamaitzi, if he takes out, right? So if he takes out, so that's from let's say from a public domain to private domain. So it says heitzah. So the Gemara says vidilma kamapik. Maybe it's also from Rishus Hayachid to Rishus Rabbin, from a private domain to a public domain. It says Baitzi, so maybe it's only from a private domain to a public domain, right? Look at the Mishnah again. Hamaitzi, someone takes out Mirshus Lirshus from one domain to another domain. So maybe because it says Hamaitzi, taking out Hamaitzi, like Haitzah, so maybe we're obligated to say that only applies from private to public. Where do we know from there that it's also from public to private? So the Gemara says, so hold on a second. If you want to say that Mishnah is only talking about taking from a private domain to a public domain, it could have said it properly. Someone that takes out from a private domain to a public domain. Why does that Mishnah say from one domain to another domain? Right? It says one domain to another domain. That even when you take from a public domain into a private domain, you're still liable, and it's still considered to be haitzah. It's taking out haitzah, yitzia, any of those words. When we use those words, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter from which domain to another domain, as long as one of them is private, one of them is public, and you take from one to the other. That's a problem. And that's what we learn from that Mishnah, right? Because in our Mishnah, it says, Yitzir Shabbos Shtayim Shein Arba. But over there in this Mishnah, it says, Hamaitzi Mirshus L'Rshus. It says from any one domain to another domain. The time of my, what's the reason? Though that the Tana in that Mishnah says Hamaitzi, he should have just said, taking something from Rishus to Rishus, from one domain to another domain. But he says taking out from one domain to another domain. Why is he used the word Havetzah? So Tana, the Gemara learns it like this. Kol akiras chayfetz mim kaima. Anytime you take something, and you take it from one domain and you put it into another domain, Haitzah karilei. It's taking it out. You're taking it out of the current domain and you're putting it into another domain. So it's called Haitzah. Originally, the Gemara thought Haitzah means taking out. Taking out means from private to public. Usually, that's the way we would think, right? Taking out. Could you take this out for me? I'm not saying if you're taking it out for me. I mean to take it outside. Outside is the public domain. Here, the Gemara says no. When you lift an object and you take it from one domain to another domain, it's called taking it out, even if it's from public to private. It's taking it out of the domain that it is in now. And that's the way the Gemara ends off that idea.
Off the subject, it's error. So if you have that scenario with three-sided common building with apartments in it,
Yeah.
and you have these two apartments create a window between them, that's private to private, and that's not a problem.
So if there is no public in between, it's not a problem.
Right, I've made a hole in the wall.
Yeah.
From my apartment.
Not a problem. Now, the problem that comes if it's the hallway that belongs to multiple people, that's a chotzer, that's like considered the same like a courtyard of back in the day, and that could be an issue that you would need a different type of erev. Amar Ravina. So we established now that haitzah, taking out, when it comes to Shabbos, the idea of taking something out does not necessarily mean taking from private to public domain. It could mean anything, taken from one domain to another domain. It means taking it out of its current state, its current domain. Haitzah on Shabbos is taking something that's in its current state and moving it into another one. So whether it's from private domain to public domain or public domain to private domain, it's both called Yitzia, taking out. That's the conclusion of the Gemara, and the Gemara is going to bring another proof to it. Amar Ravina says Masnisin, the Mishnah in Gemara Shabbos, right? Nami Daika. We could also learn it from that Mishnah, and it's very simple. The Katani in the Mishnah in Gemara Shabbos. What is it? Remember, we learned that Mishnah just a few minutes ago. Yitzia Shabbos Shtaim Shein Arba B'fnim, Shtaim Shein Arba B'chutz. Yitzia Shabbos, which is actually the first question, if I remember correctly, in Gemara Shabbos, first question that it asks over there in the Gemara, in Gemara Shabbos, it says, you say Yitzias, but you're explaining Hachnasa. You're saying taking out, and you're explaining bringing in, which the Gemara, if I remember correctly, right away at the beginning brings that question and concludes the way we have it over here, that Yitzia lav dafka doesn't mean necessarily taking out from private to public. It's just the idea of taking from one domain to another domain, right? So, but he brings it here as a proof. He says over there, the Mishnah says, taking out on Shabbos, there's two that is for inside, two that is for outside, and so he says Yitzias, but he's explaining Hachnasa, which means bringing in. So obviously, Yitzias means both. Yitzias means taking from public to private to public. Shema Mina, this is a good enough proof. This is a proof of that. Rava says something different at Bechlal. Rava Amar is the same idea, but from a different twist to it. He says Rishuyis Katani. It's not. Don't read it Yitzias Shabbos. Don't read it that this is the taking out from Shabbos. Rishuya Shabbos. When it comes to the domains of Shabbos, Shtaim Shein Arba. That's the way he learns that Gemara. Should we continue? Shtaim, meaning that's the way you should learn and that's it. What he means is that that's the way it should be in that Mishnah, not that it's Yitzia Shabbos Shtaim, it's Rishuya Shabbos Shtaim. That what it means is, because halachically, so we talk about private domain, we talk about public domain, right? So public domain is a place where it's really public, and Woodlawn ain't public. It's not a busy street. It's not considered to be a real Rishus Harabim. And I mean, according to some opinions, it is, but saying it's not definitely not a biblical one. And then there's private domain, but really there's two categories, a Carmelis and a Makom P'tur, that is a whole other discussion. There's really four Rishuyas, there's four domains. For example, the middle of the desert that belongs to no one, right? What's that? Nobody goes there, so it's not public domain, but definitely not private, because it doesn't belong to me, it doesn't belong to you, nobody has a deed for that location. So what is it? Right, so that is a Carmelis, and then there's Makom P'tur. Makom P'tur is like an area where literally nobody will go. So the whole other discussion for other scenarios. But the ones that we